When Elias Thornberg built his cabin chimney to run along the floor instead of straight up through the roof, every homesteader within 20 miles of Montana's Bitterroot Valley thought he'd finally succumbed to cabin fever. But by the end of that brutal winter of 1889, the same winter that killed over 200 cattle in a single week and froze 3 families off their claims, while his neighbors burned through 4 and 5 cords of split pine just to keep their children's breath from frosting in the night, Thornberg's floor-level flue kept his cabin at a steady 75 degrees at ankle height, consuming less than half the fuel. The principle wasn't complicated. The execution wasn't particularly difficult, and the results were undeniable. Yet it took a winter that tested every frontier family to the breaking point before anyone would admit that the strange contraption they'd been mocking for 3 months was, by every measurable standard, superior to the conventional vertical chimney design their grandfathers had used for generations. This is the story of how one Norwegian immigrant with a background in shipbuilding challenged the most fundamental assumption of frontier architecture and won. The year was 1887 when Elias Thornberg first purchased his 160-acre timber claim in western Montana's Bitterroot Valley, 6 miles south of the small settlement of Stevensville. He was 42 years old, a widower with grown children back in Wisconsin, and he'd spent the previous 23 years building cargo vessels on the shores of Lake Superior. Unlike most homesteaders flooding into Montana territory during those years, Thornberg wasn't running from debt or chasing gold fever dreams. He'd sold his share in a successful boatyard, pocketed enough capital to live comfortably, and wanted what he called silence and sufficient solitude to think. The Bitterroot Valley in the late 1880s was a place of extremes. Summer temperatures could reach 95 degrees, baking the valley floor until the native bunchgrass crackled underfoot. But winter in the Bitterroot was an entirely different proposition. Arctic air masses would pour south through the mountain passes, settling into the valley like water filling a basin. Temperature inversions trapped the cold at ground level, while warmer air floated uselessly overhead. Homesteaders routinely endured weeks where the mercury never climbed above zero, and 40 below snaps lasting 3 or 4 days were common enough that folks stopped remarking on them. The community Thornberg joined was small but established, about 37 families scattered across the valley, most of them second- or third-year homesteaders still proving up their claims. They were practical people, experienced in frontier survival, and they developed a collective wisdom about what worked and what didn't in that particular climate. Cabin construction followed predictable patterns: thick log walls chinked with moss and clay, small windows to minimize heat loss, and most importantly, a massive stone or mud brick chimney running straight up through the center of the structure, drawing smoke and heat vertically toward the roof. It was, everyone agreed, the only sensible way to build. The chimney mass absorbed heat from the fire and radiated it slowly. The vertical draw created efficient combustion, and the central placement meant the warmth spread evenly, or at least that's what people told themselves. But here's what every single one of those practical, experienced homesteaders knew and simply accepted as an immutable fact of frontier life. Their feet were always cold. Not just chilly, not just uncomfortable, cold in a way that ached deep into the bone, that made sleep difficult, that caused frostbite even inside the cabin if you removed your boots for more than a few minutes. Cold that settled in your joints and didn't leave until May. The physics of it were brutally simple. Heat rises. The wood stove or fireplace, positioned at roughly waist height for cooking convenience, would heat the air immediately around it. That warm air would climb straight up, accumulating at the ceiling where it did absolutely nothing useful except make the roof warm enough to melt snow, which would then refreeze as ice dams. Meanwhile, at floor level where human beings actually lived and slept, the temperature remained stubbornly, dangerously cold. Families would measure a 60-degree difference between ceiling and floor temperatures, 75 degrees at head height, 15 degrees at ankle height. Thomas Hagen, a fellow homesteader and occasional carpenter, had tried to solve the problem in the winter of 1886 by building a raised sleeping platform closer to the ceiling heat. His children lasted 3 nights up there before the combination of poor air quality and claustrophobic enclosure drove them back down to their frost-edged bedrolls on the floor. Margaret Spencer had experimented with a system of tin reflectors designed to bounce heat downward. They worked for about 18 inches in front of the stove and nowhere else. John Kirkwood had built a second, smaller fireplace at floor level in one corner, which consumed an enormous amount of additional fuel, created a dangerous secondary source of sparks and embers, and still left 3/4 of his floor space numbingly cold. The consequence of this chronic cold floor problem extended beyond mere discomfort. Frostbite was common. Respiratory illnesses flourished in the temperature extremes: hot, dry air at breathing height, freezing dampness at foot level. Children developed persistent coughs that lasted the entire winter. Elderly settlers suffered joint pain that bordered on debilitating. And every family burned through truly staggering amounts of firewood, 3 to 5 cords per winter, trying unsuccessfully to heat the space where cold air pooled. It was expensive. It was exhausting. It was, quite literally, killing people at the margins. And yet the conventional wisdom held firm. A chimney goes straight up. That's how chimneys work. That's how they've always worked. To suggest otherwise was to reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of basic principles. Elias Thornberg saw it differently. Thornberg spent his first Montana summer building a temporary shelter and observing. He was a man trained in the engineering principles of maritime construction, a discipline where heat management wasn't just about comfort, but about preventing condensation, managing thermal expansion, and creating livable spaces in environments just as hostile as the Montana frontier. On ships, particularly the iron-hulled cargo vessels he'd worked on during his last decade in the boatyard, heat moved through conduction along metal surfaces. Engine room heat would travel through bulkheads and deck plates, warming spaces far from the source fire. It was a problem in summer. The whole vessel became an oven. But in winter, that thermal conductivity meant strategically placed surfaces could distribute warmth far more efficiently than air convection alone. But Thornberg's insight came from an even more specific memory. In 1879, he'd helped retrofit a cargo steamer with an experimental heating system designed by a Danish engineer named Søren Hjorth. Instead of relying solely on the engine's radiant heat, Hjorth had run a series of exhaust pipes horizontally along the lower deck before venting them up through a single stack. The logic was elegant. Capture the waste heat, move it where it was needed most, and only then let it escape. The ship owners had ultimately removed the system. It was too expensive to maintain, and the horizontal runs collected creosote, but Thornberg remembered how effective it had been. The lower decks, typically freezing on Great Lakes winter runs, had remained genuinely warm. Not just warm at breathing height, but warm underfoot. That memory crystallized during his first Montana winter, which he spent in a borrowed cabin in Stevensville. He'd lie in his bedroll, feeling the cold radiating up through the floorboards despite a roaring fire just 8 feet away, and he'd think about those warm ship decks. The principle was transferable. Heat from a stove or fireplace didn't have to go straight up. Flue gases contained enormous thermal energy, energy that was being wasted, sent directly out into the atmosphere. If that energy could be routed horizontally first, along the coldest surfaces where it was actually needed, the efficiency gains would be dramatic. But here's what stopped most people from even considering such a design. Chimneys need to be drawn. Everyone knew that. A vertical column of hot air creates negative pressure at the base, pulling fresh air into the fire and pushing exhaust up and out. It's fundamental. Disrupt that vertical column. Run the pipe horizontally, and you'd risk backdrafting smoke into the living space, or worse, extinguishing the fire through oxygen starvation. Thornberg understood this concern. He'd seen poorly designed ship ventilation systems that created exactly those problems. But he also understood something most frontier homesteaders didn't. Draw isn't about straight vertical distance. It's about total vertical rise and proper pipe sizing. A flue pipe could run horizontally for considerable distance, 10, even 15 feet, as long as it maintained a slight upward pitch and eventually achieved sufficient total vertical rise to create adequate draft pressure. The question wasn't whether it could work. The question was whether it could work well enough to justify the unconventional design and the social ridicule that would inevitably follow. By the spring of 1888, Thornberg had made his decision. He would build his permanent cabin with a floor-level heating flue, and he'd prove the principle was sound. Thornberg made the mistake of mentioning his plan at a community barn raising in late April of 1888. The response was immediate and unambiguous. "You'll smoke yourself out in an hour," John Kirkwood said flatly. Kirkwood was a respected voice. He'd survived 3 Montana winters and helped build 11 cabins in the valley. Margaret Spencer was less diplomatic. Elias, I don't doubt your skill with boats, but a ship's not a cabin and Lake Superior's not the Bitterroot. A chimney goes up. There's no other way that makes any sense. Thomas Hagen, who considered himself something of an amateur engineer, launched into a 10-minute explanation of why horizontal flue runs would accumulate creosote, create fire hazards, and fail to generate proper draw. He wasn't wrong about the creosote. That was a legitimate concern, but his conclusion that the design was therefore impossible revealed a fixed mindset Thornberg had encountered many times before. Problems were insurmountable obstacles rather than challenges requiring thoughtful solutions. The criticism wasn't malicious. These were good people, practical people, people who'd survived harsh conditions through careful adherence to proven methods. From their perspective, Thornberg's plan represented dangerous experimentation that could cost him his life when winter arrived. They were trying to save him from his own foolishness. But Thornberg had learned something during his years in the boatyard. Conventional wisdom is often just conventional. It's not wisdom until it's been tested against alternatives. He spent May and June doing calculations. The cabin would be 24 feet by 18 feet, with walls of 14-inch thick ponderosa pine logs. The stove, a substantial cast-iron model he'd had shipped from Chicago, would sit not in the center but along the north wall. The flue pipe would extend horizontally from the stove, running at floor level along the east wall for 12 feet, then turning and running another 6 feet along the south wall, before finally rising vertically through a carefully engineered chimney box in the southwest corner. Total horizontal run, 18 feet. Total vertical rise once the pipe turned upward, 14 feet, extending 3 feet above the roofline. The horizontal sections would have a constant 1-inch rise per linear foot, just enough pitch to allow condensation to drain back toward the stove rather than pooling in the pipe. He'd use 6-inch diameter pipe for the floor runs, expanding to 8-inch for the vertical section to enhance draw. And he'd engineer clean-out ports at 3 locations for creosote removal. The materials list was specific: 27 feet of 6-inch stove pipe, 14 feet of 8-inch pipe, 11 elbow joints, 3 inspection ports, 18 feet of 1/4-inch iron plate for heat shields, and enough brick to build a thermal mass base supporting the horizontal runs. He ordered the pipe and fittings from a foundry in Missoula, paying $47, a substantial investment that represented nearly a month's expenses. When the shipment arrived in Stevensville and word got around what Thornberg was buying, the speculation began in earnest. He's building some kind of steam radiator system, one rumor went. No, he's planning a heated floor, like the Romans had, said another. The truth, that he was simply routing a stovepipe along the floor before venting it, was somehow both more mundane and more radical than anyone imagined. Thornberg broke ground on his permanent cabin on July 2, 1888. He worked alone for the most part, though Thomas Hagen, skepticism notwithstanding, helped with the roof raising, and 2 younger men from Stevensville earned day wages assisting with the heaviest log placement. The foundation was conventional enough, a perimeter of flat stones mortared with clay and lime, creating a level base elevated 6 inches above grade for drainage. But inside that perimeter, Thornberg built something unusual, a secondary foundation of bricks, arranged in a U-shape that would eventually support the horizontal flue runs. This brick base served multiple functions. It provided stable, fire-resistant support for the cast-iron pipe. It would absorb and store thermal energy from the hot flue gases, extending the heat output even after the fire banked. And it elevated the pipe to exactly 4 inches above the finished floor surface, low enough to radiate heat directly to the coldest air layer, high enough to prevent accidental contact burns. The cabin walls rose through July, 14 rounds of carefully scribed logs, each one fitted to minimize gaps. Thornberg used traditional Scandinavian corner notching, a technique he'd learned from his father. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of moss, clay, and horsehair, creating an insulating barrier that would remain flexible through freeze-thaw cycles. By early August, the roof structure was complete. Hand-split cedar shakes over log rafters, pitched at 45 degrees to shed snow. A small sleeping loft occupied the western third of the cabin, accessible by a ladder. 2 windows, each 18 inches square, glazed with real glass panes that cost him $8 total, faced south and east for maximum winter sunlight. Then came the phase that drew spectators. On August 14th, Thornberg began installing the horizontal flue pipe. He'd marked the route precisely, using a chalk line and a spirit level to ensure the consistent 1 inch per foot rise. The stove would sit against the north wall, its rear flue collar 18 inches above the floor. The pipe would immediately drop on a steep angle. He used a 45-degree elbow joint, bringing it down to the 4-inch height, where it would begin its horizontal journey. Margaret Spencer rode out to see it on August 16th. She stood in the doorway, watching Thornberg carefully support and seal the pipe sections, and she shook her head slowly. "Elias, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but that pipe is going to draft backwards. Mark my words." John Kirkwood visited on August 19th. He inspected the brick foundation, tapped the pipe with his knuckles, and calculated the horizontal distance. 18 feet horizontal before it rises? That's too much run, Elias. The gases will cool too quickly, lose their buoyancy, and settle. You'll have smoke pouring out of that stove. Thornberg didn't argue. He just kept working, applying high-temperature seal compound to each joint, testing each connection for airtightness. The horizontal runs were surrounded by a heat shield assembly of his own design, 1/4-inch iron plate mounted on ceramic standoffs, creating a 1/2-inch air gap between the pipe and the shield, with another 1/2-inch gap between the shield and any combustible surfaces. This would prevent direct fire contact while maximizing radiant heat transfer into the living space. The floor beneath the pipe route was covered with thin slate tiles, not for appearance, but for thermal conductivity. The pipe made its L-shaped journey, 12 feet east along the north wall, then 6 feet south along the east wall, before reaching the southwest corner where the vertical chimney would rise. Thornberg had engineered this corner carefully. The transition from horizontal to vertical used two 45-degree elbows rather than a single 90-degree joint, creating a smoother flow path for the exhaust gases. And the vertical section was built with a double-wall design, an 8-inch inner pipe surrounded by a 12-inch outer pipe, with the space between packed with sand for thermal mass. This vertical thermal mass chimney rose 14 feet, passing through a carefully sealed roof penetration and extending 3 feet above the peak, sufficient height to ensure draw even in high winds. The total installation took Thornberg 9 days of careful work. When he finished on August 23, 1888, he had created something that no one in the Bitterroot Valley had ever seen. A heating system that would send the flue gases on an 18-foot journey through the coldest zone of the cabin before finally allowing them to escape. But what the neighbors saw, the unusual pipe routing, the floor-level installation, the massive corner chimney, that was only the visible innovation. The real genius of Thornberg's design lay in something no casual observer would notice: the specific ratio of horizontal surface area to flue gas volume, and the engineered thermal battery hidden in the brick foundation. Here's what Thornberg understood from his maritime experience. Heat transfer efficiency is a function of surface area and time. A conventional straight vertical chimney moves hot exhaust gases through 6 or 7 feet of interior space in less than 2 seconds. Contact time between hot gases and cabin air is minimal. Most of the thermal energy escapes and used. By routing the flue gases through 18 feet of horizontal pipe before allowing vertical escape, Thornberg increased the interior exposure surface area by nearly 300%. But more importantly, he slowed the gas velocity. The horizontal runs and elbow joints created just enough resistance that the gases spent approximately 4 to 5 seconds in contact with the cabin's thermal envelope before exiting. That's more than twice the contact time, which translates, according to heat transfer calculations, to roughly 50 to 60% better thermal energy capture. But Thornberg went further. That brick foundation beneath the pipe wasn't just structural support. It was a thermal battery, carefully sized to match the system's heat output. The brick mass, roughly 400 pounds of it, would absorb heat during active firing and release it slowly over hours after the fire banked. This created thermal stability, preventing the dramatic temperature swings common in conventional cabins where vigorous heat during firing gave way to rapid cooling once the stove's fuel depleted. The principle was ancient. Korean Ondal floor heating systems and Roman hypocausts had used thermal mass storage for millennia, but the specific application to a wood-fired frontier cabin stove was Thornberg's innovation. He'd calculated the brick quantity precisely. Too little mass wouldn't provide meaningful storage. Too much would take too long to heat up and would rob the system of immediate warmth. And there was one more hidden element, perhaps the most counterintuitive. Thornberg had deliberately under-insulated the horizontal pipe runs. While the vertical chimney was double-walled and sandpacked to retain heat and maintain draw, the horizontal sections were designed to leak thermal energy into the cabin as efficiently as possible. The heat shields prevented fire danger, but allowed maximum radiant heat transfer. Every BTU that radiated into the cabin at floor level was a BTU that didn't escape uselessly into the atmosphere. This ran completely counter to modern stove installation practices, which aim for maximum combustion efficiency through heat retention. But Thornberg wasn't optimizing for combustion efficiency. He was optimizing for practical human comfort in a specific cold floor syndrome environment. He was willing to sacrifice a bit of draft strength and burning temperature in exchange for dramatically better heat distribution where it mattered most. The system was a carefully balanced compromise between competing requirements: sufficient draw to prevent backdrafting, sufficient heat retention to maintain draw, and sufficient heat radiation to warm the floor zone. Get any one element wrong: pipe diameter too small, horizontal run too long, brick mass too large, and the whole system would fail. Thornberg completed his cabin on September 7, 1888. He spent the next 3 weeks installing furnishings: a rope frame bed in the loft, a simple table and 2 chairs, open shelving along the west wall, and carefully organized storage for his winter supplies. He'd put up 37 quarts of preserved vegetables, smoked 60 pounds of venison, and stacked 2.5 cords of split ponderosa pine in a covered woodshed behind the cabin, his calculated winter fuel supply. 2.5 cords. His neighbors were putting up 4, 5, even 6 cords depending on their cabin size and family needs. On September 21st, he conducted his first full system test. Morning temperature was 38 degrees, chilly enough to justify a fire, warm enough that the test wouldn't be definitive. He loaded the stove with kindling and medium splits, opened the air intake fully, and struck a match. The kindling caught immediately. Flames built. The characteristic roar of drawing air filled the cabin, and the smoke went exactly where it was supposed to go, into the pipe, along the horizontal runs, and up through the vertical chimney. No backdraft. No spillage. Clean, efficient combustion. Thornberg spent that day monitoring temperatures at different locations. After 4 hours of moderate firing, he recorded these readings: at the stove surface, 420 degrees Fahrenheit. At the horizontal pipe midpoint, 310 degrees. At floor level directly beside the pipe, 78 degrees. At floor level 8 feet from the pipe, 54 degrees. At ceiling height, 62 degrees. The system worked. The floor was warmer than the ceiling. He'd inverted the conventional temperature gradient. But September in the Bitterroot Valley isn't winter. The real test would come when ambient temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days. When wind chill made exposed flesh freeze in minutes. When every other cabin in the valley was burning through cordwood at desperate rates just to maintain survivable interior conditions. Word of his first successful fire spread through the community quickly. Thomas Hagen had stopped by that afternoon and seen the system operating. The response was cautiously skeptical. It works in September, Hagen admitted. But wait for January. Wait for 20 below. That's when you'll see if it really works. John Kirkwood was more direct. The coldest weather is when you need the hottest fire. When you're running that stove hard, pushing out maximum heat, that's when the creosote will build up in those horizontal runs. That's when you'll get a chimney fire. Best case, you'll have to shut down and clean it constantly. Worst case, you'll burn down. Margaret Spencer, ever practical, began quietly organizing a collection of extra firewood from nearby families, stored discreetly at her own property. For when Elias runs short, she told her husband. Because he will. That little woodpile won't last him past New Year's. Thornberg knew what they were thinking. The old fool with his boats and his theories was going to suffer for his stubbornness. And when he did, the community would help him, not with smugness, but with genuine frontier solidarity, because that's what neighbors did. He hoped he wouldn't need to prove them wrong, but he was prepared to do exactly that. October passed. November arrived with light snows and moderate cold, nothing extreme. Thornberg fired his stove regularly, maintaining comfortable temperatures, burning through wood at what he calculated was about 60% the rate of a conventional cabin. The system continued to perform flawlessly. He cleaned the horizontal pipe sections once in early November, finding minimal creosote accumulation, far less than he'd expected and far less than his calculations had predicted. The reason, he eventually concluded, was simple. The gases stayed hot enough during their horizontal journey that moisture and volatiles didn't condense as readily as in a poorly designed system. The slight upward pitch allowed what little condensation did form to drain back toward the stove where it revaporized. The system was self-managing in ways he'd hoped for but hadn't quite dared to count on. By late November, the neighbors had mostly stopped speculating. The unusual heating system worked well enough in moderate weather. When real winter arrived, they'd see the limitations. Until then, there wasn't much to say. December brought heavier snow and sharper cold, but nothing unusual. Thornberg's comfort level remained high. His fuel consumption remained low. And in the valley below, families settled into the familiar winter routine of constant fire tending, eternal cold feet, and patience for spring. Then the weather changed. On January 9, 1889, the barometric pressure began to fall. Ranchers who paid attention to such things noticed their animals growing restless. The air took on a peculiar crystalline quality, sounds carrying farther than usual. Old-timers in Stevensville, men who'd been through 20 Montana winters or more, started making preparations. A big cold is coming, they said. 3, for days at least. Maybe worse. They were right. They just didn't know how much worse. The cold front arrived on January 11th, not gradually, but like a physical wall. The temperature dropped 43 degrees in 6 hours. By nightfall, it was 12 below zero. By midnight, 22 below. By dawn on January 12th, 34 below zero, with a northwest wind that drove the effective temperature to something approaching 50 below. And it didn't ease up. For 3 straight days, the Bitterroot stayed locked in brutal sub-zero cold. January 12th hovering around minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, briefly lifting near minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit by midday, then sinking to minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit by night. January 13th dropped even harder, sliding from minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning to minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit by evening. By January 14th, it was bottoming out, 42 degree F at dawn, barely improving to minus 39 degrees Fahrenheit at midday, then falling again to minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit as darkness returned. This cold that created its own weather. Ice fog hanging in the valley, frost smoke rising from the river, the air itself seeming to freeze into a solid state. Cold that made trees explode with rifle crack reports when sap froze and expanded. Cold that killed cattle standing in their pastures, froze chickens solid in their coops, and turned inadequately heated cabins into death traps. In the valley below Thornberg's claim, families fought for survival. John Kirkwood's family burned through half a cord of wood in the first 2 days, splitting and hauling and feeding the stove constantly, desperately, knowing that if the fire went out even for an hour, the interior temperature would plummet to lethal levels. Despite their efforts, frost formed on the interior walls. Water in buckets froze 18 inches from the stove. And the floor was an icebox. Kirkwood's youngest daughter developed frostbite on her toes while sleeping, despite wearing 2 pairs of wool socks inside her blankets. Margaret Spencer's husband, George, took to sleeping beside the stove itself, tending it through the night, while Margaret and their 3 children huddled under every blanket and hid in the house. They burned 4.5 cords that winter, and 2 cords of it went up the chimney during that single January cold snap. Thomas Hagen's attempt at a dual fireplace system proved actively dangerous. The second fire consumed so much oxygen that the family woke up gasping, headaches pounding, carbon monoxide levels dangerously elevated. He extinguished the second fireplace, and they suffered with conventional single-stove cold like everyone else. 3 families abandoned their claims entirely during that January freeze, packing what they could carry and retreating to Stevensville to wait out the winter in communal housing. One elderly couple, the Andersons, who'd held a claim for 4 years, were found dead in their cabin on January 16th. They'd run out of firewood. The interior temperature when neighbors discovered them was estimated at 40 below zero. The cold was an enemy that overwhelmed conventional defenses. It found every gap, every weakness, every thermodynamic vulnerability in frontier cabin design. And it killed without mercy. 6 miles up the valley, in his cabin with the ridiculous floor-level chimney, Elias Thornberg was warm. Not surviving warm. Not making do warm. Actually, genuinely comfortable warm. On the morning of January 12th, when the cold truly set in, Thornberg woke in his loft and climbed down to a cabin interior that measured 47 degrees. Cool, certainly, but nowhere near frozen. He built up his fire, loaded the stove with medium splits, and began his day. By mid-morning, with the stove burning at moderate intensity, not pushed hard, not glowing red, just steady, sustainable combustion, he recorded the following temperatures. By mid-morning, the readings told the story clearly. The floor beside the horizontal flue held at 73 degrees Fahrenheit, easing to 68 degrees Fahrenheit across the center of the cabin and 61 degrees Fahrenheit even in the farthest corner. At breathing height, the air stayed a comfortable 64 degrees Fahrenheit, while the ceiling, where heat usually wasted itself, never rose above 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The coldest spot in his cabin, the ceiling, was warmer than the warmest spot in most of his neighbors' cabins that day, which was typically the air immediately surrounding the stove. More remarkably, his fuel consumption remained modest. He loaded the stove every 4 hours, 5 to 6 splits of medium-sized pine, each loading. Over the course of January 12th, he burned approximately 30 pounds of wood. A conventional cabin maintaining barely survivable temperatures was burning 80 to 100 pounds per day during that same period. The horizontal flue radiated heat exactly where it was needed. The brick thermal mass beneath absorbed energy during active firing and released it slowly, keeping the floor zone warm even as the fire burned down between loadings. The system's efficiency meant that nearly every BTU produced by wood combustion stayed inside the cabin's thermal envelope instead of escaping up a straight vertical chimney. And his feet, which in every conventional frontier cabin would have been numb, aching, edging toward frostbite, his feet were warm. Genuinely, comfortably warm. He could walk barefoot on his cabin floor in the middle of the worst cold snap in Montana Territory history. On January 13th, Thomas Hagen struggled through knee-deep snow and wind that threatened to knock him down, making the journey from his cabin to Thornberg's claim. He needed to borrow tools, but more than that, he needed to see if the man was still alive. The cold was beyond anything they'd prepared for. Hagen was genuinely worried. He found Thornberg splitting firewood outside in shirt sleeves. Not a heavy winter coat. Shirt sleeves. Good Lord, Elias, get inside before you freeze, Hagen shouted over the wind. Thornberg looked up, smiled slightly, and gestured toward his cabin. I'm plenty warm, Thomas. Been out here 15 minutes and haven't even felt the cold yet. Built up a good heat from the work. Hagen went inside to retrieve the tools. What he found stopped him in his tracks. The cabin was a haven. Genuinely warm throughout. No temperature gradient from hellfire near the stove to Arctic freeze in the corners. Just even, comfortable, foot-level warmth radiating from those ridiculous horizontal pipes he'd been so certain would fail. Hagen stood there for a full minute, just feeling it. Then he crouched down, held his hands near the floor-level pipe, felt the radiating heat, and shook his head slowly. I'll be damned, he said quietly. It actually works. It does, Thornberg confirmed. How much wood are you burning? About a third of what you are, I'd estimate. Maybe less. Hagen looked at the modest fire in the stove. Not roaring, not pushed to maximum output, just burning steadily. He looked at the horizontal pipe making its L-shaped journey around the cabin perimeter. He looked at the peaceful, comfortable living space that should have been impossible in 40 below temperatures. I mocked you, Hagen said. We all did. You did. We were wrong. You were. Hagen left with the borrowed tools and something else, a story that would spread through the valley faster than the cold itself. By January 15th, 7 different homesteaders had made the difficult journey to Thornberg's cabin, drawn by Hagen's account and by sheer desperate curiosity. Some came to see if the story was exaggerated. Some came hoping to understand how they might modify their own systems midwinter. All of them came away convinced. John Kirkwood brought a thermometer. He wanted independent verification. He measured floor temperature at multiple locations, compared them to ceiling temperatures, and calculated the fuel consumption rate based on Thornberg's wood stack reduction. His conclusion, delivered with the blunt honesty of a man who'd been vocally wrong. This system outperforms conventional design by every measure. Comfort, efficiency, fuel economy, temperature distribution, everything. It's not even close. The numbers were undeniable. On January 15, 1889, with the outside temperature locked at -38 degrees Fahrenheit, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Thornberg's cabin, using the floor-level flue system, averaged 69 degrees Fahrenheit at the floor, 65 degrees Fahrenheit at breathing height, and just 59 degrees Fahrenheit at the ceiling, while burning only 28 pounds of wood per day. By comparison, John Kirkwood's conventional cabin managed only 23 degrees Fahrenheit at floor level, despite 61 degrees Fahrenheit at head height, and a sweltering 78 degrees Fahrenheit near the ceiling, consuming 94 pounds of wood daily. The Spencer cabin fared even worse. Floors at 19 degrees Fahrenheit, breathable air at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, heat trapped uselessly overhead at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, and a staggering 101 pounds of wood burned each day. Thornberg's floor was 46 degrees warmer than his neighbor's floors, while his ceiling was 19 degrees cooler, because the heat was where it needed to be, not wasted at roof level. And he was accomplishing this using less than one-third the fuel. Margaret Spencer, whose quiet preparations to help Thornberg survive his supposed folly had proved unnecessary, was perhaps the most generous in her admission. "I thought you were being foolish," she told him directly. "I thought you'd suffer for your stubbornness. I was wrong, and I'm woman enough to say it plainly. What you've built here is remarkable." The community's response wasn't merely polite acknowledgement. It was genuine respect, tinged with the particular admiration that practical frontier people reserve for someone who'd solved a real problem with elegant innovation. So why did Thornberg's system work where conventional wisdom said it shouldn't? The answer lies in understanding three distinct but interrelated physical principles. Principle number 1, radiant heat transfer versus convective heat transfer. A conventional cabin stove heats primarily through convection. Hot air rises away from the heat source, accumulates at the ceiling, and eventually, very gradually, mixes with the colder air at floor level through turbulent circulation. This is an inherently inefficient process for heating the coldest zone because you're fighting against gravity. Heat naturally wants to rise, and you're asking it to somehow descend and warm the floor. Thornberg's system used radiant heat transfer. The cast iron stovepipe at floor level became a radiator, literally radiating infrared thermal energy directly into the coldest air mass. This energy didn't have to rise and then somehow circulate downward. It was delivered exactly where cold air pooled, directly heating that air through radiation and immediate contact conduction. Additionally, the brick thermal mass absorbed radiant energy and conducted it through the masonry structure, creating a massive low-temperature radiator that distributed heat evenly along its entire length. This is the same principle used in masonry heaters, Russian fireplaces, and Korean ondol systems, thermal mass storage, and radiant distribution. Principle number 2, increased heat exchange surface area. In a conventional cabin, the heat exchange surface inside the living space consists of the stove body itself and perhaps 6 to 8 feet of vertical stovepipe before it exits through the roof. Let's estimate that at roughly 12 square feet of heat radiating surface. Thornberg's system included the stove body plus 18 feet of horizontal pipe, approximately 4 square feet per linear foot of 6-inch pipe, plus 14 feet of vertical pipe, approximately 5 square feet per linear foot of 8-inch pipe. That's roughly 84 square feet of heat radiating surface, a 7-fold increase. More surface area in contact with cabin air for a longer duration means dramatically more efficient heat transfer. It's not complicated mathematics. It's fundamental thermodynamics applied with precision. Principle number 3, controlled thermal mass buffering. Temperature stability matters as much as absolute temperature. A cabin that swings from 80 degrees during active firing to 40 degrees an hour after the fire banks is uncomfortable and inefficient. You're constantly overheating and then suffering through the cool down. The brick thermal mass in Thornberg's system absorbed heat during high output periods and released it during low output periods, creating a buffering effect. The system's temperature curve was flat and stable. Once the cabin reached equilibrium, typically about 3 hours after morning fire building, It maintained that temperature with minimal variation for 18 to 20 hours, even with only moderate fire tending. This meant Thornberg could let his fire burn down to coals overnight, banking it with ash to preserve the ember bed, and wake to a cabin that was still 63 to 65 degrees at floor level. His neighbors, lacking thermal mass storage, would wake to cabins that had dropped into the 40s or below, requiring immediate aggressive fire building just to reach survivable temperatures. The skeptics' primary concern, creosote accumulation in horizontal runs, proved to be manageable rather than catastrophic. Creosote forms when flue gases cool below approximately 250 degrees Fahrenheit, causing volatile organic compounds and water vapor to condense as tar-like residue. Thornberg's system avoided heavy creosote buildup through three design elements. First, the 6-inch pipe diameter was deliberately sized small enough that gas velocity remained high even in horizontal runs, preventing excessive cooling. Second, the slight upward pitch allowed condensation to drain back toward the stove. Third, the system's overall efficiency meant he burned less wood total, producing less smoke and fewer volatiles. He cleaned the horizontal sections monthly during peak winter, a 15-minute maintenance task that involved opening the inspection ports and running a brush through. The accumulation was light, fluffy, and easily removed. Nothing like the hard, glazed creosote that forms in poorly designed systems with inadequate draw. Thornberg's innovation, while novel in the Montana Territory context, was hardly unprecedented in human history. Floor-level heating using waste heat from fires is one of humanity's oldest thermal management techniques. The Korean Ondal system, developed over 2,000 years ago, routed smoke and hot gases from a cooking fire through a network of stone channels beneath the floor before venting through an exterior chimney. The floor itself became a giant radiator, heated from below, providing remarkably efficient and comfortable warmth. Ondal systems are still used in Korea today, adapted for modern fuels. Roman hypocausts used similar principles. Fires in underground furnaces produced hot gases that circulated through raised floors and hollow wall chambers before exiting through vertical flues. Wealthy Roman households enjoyed floor-level warmth throughout their villas, a luxury that wouldn't be replicated in Europe for over 1,000 years after Rome's fall. Even in colonial America, some German settlers built 5-plate stoves and 10-plate stoves that extended the heating surface into adjacent rooms through short horizontal flue runs. These were less sophisticated than Thornberg's system, typically just a few feet of additional pipe, but they acknowledged the same basic principle. Extending the heat exchange surface area improves efficiency. So why had this knowledge been largely forgotten by the American frontier era? Several factors contributed. Economics. Cast iron was expensive. Extending a stove system with 18 additional feet of pipe and multiple elbows represented significant capital investment in an era when most homesteaders were cash poor. The cheapest solution was a straight vertical chimney built from field stone or mud brick. Free materials, minimal metal required. Building speed. Frontier settlers needed shelter fast. A conventional cabin could be built in a week by a small crew. Thornberg's system required planning, precise measurement, and careful installation, adding days to construction time that desperate homesteaders often didn't have. Knowledge transmission. Complex heating system design was specialist knowledge, held by European stonemasons and master builders. That knowledge didn't always transfer to the American frontier, where practical expedience trumped sophisticated engineering. Fuel abundance. In heavily forested regions, firewood was nearly free. Why invest in efficiency when you could simply burn more wood? The calculus changed only when you experienced a winter like January 1889, when the supply suddenly became insufficient regardless of how much you'd stored. Thornberg's floor-level flue principle remains valid today, though modern materials and building codes require adaptation. Contemporary wood stove installations emphasize vertical exhaust for maximum draft and combustion efficiency. But the principle of extending heat exchange surface at floor level can be applied through radiant floor heating systems using water or glycol circulated through tubing embedded in thermal mass, essentially a modern ondal, heat recovery ventilation systems that capture exhaust heat, and masonry heater designs that incorporate long internal flue pathways through stone or brick mass before venting. A modern homesteader seeking to replicate Thornberg's approach would face building code challenges. Current fire safety codes generally prohibit extended horizontal stovepipe runs without specific engineering approval. But the underlying principle of delivering heat at floor level rather than wasting it at ceiling level can be achieved through code-compliant methods that Thornberg would instantly recognize as descendants of his innovation. The economic case remains compelling. Heating costs represent a substantial fraction of household expenses in cold climates. Any system that maintains comfort while reducing fuel consumption by 60 to 70% pays for itself quickly. Modern materials: insulated chimney pipe, high-efficiency wood gasification stoves, ceramic thermal mass materials could push performance even beyond what Thornberg achieved. The environmental case is equally strong. More efficient fuel usage means less wood consumption, reduced particulate emissions, and smaller carbon footprint. Thornberg's system was accidentally sustainable, achieving efficiency through clever design rather than modern environmental consciousness. Perhaps most importantly, the philosophy underlying Thornberg's innovation remains relevant. Question conventional wisdom, understand fundamental principles rather than blindly following tradition, and design solutions tailored to specific problems rather than accepting one-size-fits-all approaches. The winter of 1889 broke in late March. By the time spring arrived, 7 homesteading families in the Bitterroot Valley had made arrangements with Thornberg to help design modified heating systems for their cabins. 3 families completely rebuilt their chimneys using Thornberg's floor-level flue principle. For others, installed supplementary horizontal runs that captured additional heat from existing vertical chimneys. Thomas Hagen's installation, completed in August 1889, used a slightly modified design. His stove remained central, but the flue pipe ran horizontally for 8 feet in 2 directions, creating an X pattern of floor-level heat before rising through a central chimney. Not as efficient as Thornberg's corner vent design, but a 60% improvement over his previous system. John Kirkwood, ever the pragmatist, documented the comparative fuel consumption data over the following 3 winters. His findings, published in the Stevensville newspaper in 1892, provided empirical validation. Cabins using floor-level flue extensions consumed an average of 42% less fuel while maintaining superior comfort levels, specifically at floor height, where cold-related health problems originated. Margaret Spencer became an unexpected advocate. She convinced her husband George to install a modified system in 1890, and she subsequently advised 3 other women in the community on practical implementation details. Floor-level heating, she argued, wasn't just about comfort, it was about child health. Her own children's persistent winter coughs diminished significantly once the cabin floor stayed consistently warm. Thornberg's original cabin stood until 1923, when it was dismantled by a timber company clearing the land. By then, Thornberg himself had died, peacefully, in his sleep, in the winter of 1904. He was 61 years old. A brief obituary in the Stevensville Register noted his contributions to improved heating methods for frontier dwellings, but provided few details. His innovation had become so integrated into local building practices that it no longer seemed remarkable. No photographs of Thornberg's interior heating system are known to exist. No detailed technical drawings survived. What remains are scattered references in letters, diaries, and newspaper accounts, fragments documenting a practical innovation that briefly changed how people lived in a harsh climate, before being gradually forgotten as frontier life gave way to modernity. The story of Elias Thornberg's floor-level chimney is ultimately about the fragility and resilience of practical knowledge. Somewhere in the progression from frontier survival to modern convenience, we lost the immediate necessity that drove innovation like Thornberg's. Central heating, insulation technology, and abundant energy made the specific problem of cold cabin floors irrelevant for most people. And when the problem disappeared, so did the hard-won solutions. But the principle remains: direct observation, careful reasoning, and willingness to challenge convention can solve problems that generations before you simply accepted as inevitable. Thornberg didn't have advanced materials or complex tools. He had clear thinking and the courage to be mocked. The frontier demanded that kind of thinking, not because people were smarter or braver then, but because the margin for error was thinner. Cold feet weren't just uncomfortable. They led to frostbite, to illness, to death. Wasting firewood wasn't just inefficient. It could mean your family didn't survive until spring. Modern life has cushioned us from many of those immediate consequences, which is progress we should celebrate. But that cushion has also allowed conventional wisdom to calcify, because the cost of not questioning it has diminished. We can live with inefficiency, with suboptimal solutions, with doing things the way they've always been done, until we can't. The knowledge that kept frontier settlers alive through 40 below winters didn't disappear. It just got buried under modern convenience and industrial building practices. Elias Thornberg's floor-level flue proved that sometimes the old ways weren't just different. They were objectively superior by every measurable standard: comfort, efficiency, fuel economy, and practical livability. This is one of 47 forgotten techniques I've documented that still outperform their modern equivalents. Next, I'll show you how a Wyoming rancher in 1893 designed a passive cooling system that kept his root cellar at 38 degrees in August without electricity, ice, or any moving parts, using nothing but thermal mass, strategic airflow, and principles that modern refrigeration engineers are only now beginning to rediscover. His neighbors called it impossible. Physics called it elegant. Each of these techniques represents decades or centuries of hard-won wisdom that solved real survival problems with elegant simplicity. Problems that, in many cases, we still face today, just dressed in modern clothes. Energy efficiency, climate adaptation, self-reliance in uncertain times. If you're the kind of person who values practical knowledge over popular opinion, who believes self-reliance is worth learning, and who wants to understand the techniques that actually kept people alive before electricity and modern technology made us comfortable and forgetful, then subscribe. I release new documentaries like this every day, each one uncovering survival wisdom that worked then and still works now. Not because the past was better, but because the physics haven't changed and the problems are more similar than we'd like to admit. The cold is coming. It always does. And when it arrives, you want to be the person who understands why your feet should be warmer than your ceiling. Not because someone told you to believe it, but because you've traced the principle back to its source and watched it prove itself against reality. Welcome to forgotten wisdom that still works.